Every morning, without fail, the dog barked at the train driver as his locomotive rumbled past the crossing. For 3 years, the same golden retriever mix stood in the same spot, barking with relentless determination, as if trying to deliver a message no one understood. At first, the driver, Thomas, dismissed it as nothing more than a stray's odd habit until the day the barking stopped. That was when everything changed, revealing a story far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Thomas Bennett had been a train driver for over 25 years, waking up before dawn and guiding his locomotive through the same familiar route across the countryside. He was a man of routine his life, measured not by days or seasons, but by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on the tracks, the changing landscapes outside his window, and the quiet solitude of his engine cabin. The town of Pinehaven, where he passed every morning, was a sleepy rural place, the kind of town where people lingered at the general store just to chat, where the biggest news of the week might be someone's cow wandering too far from its pasture. Life moved slowly here, much like the old freight trains that rumbled through at a steady, unhurried pace. It was on one such morning in late autumn that Thomas first noticed the dog. As his train rounded the bend near a lonely railway crossing just outside of town, he spotted a scruffy golden retriever mix standing by the tracks. The dog was barking a deep, urgent sound that cut through the cool morning air. Thomas barely had time to register it before the train passed by, but something about the scene stuck with him. The next morning, the dog was there again, same spot, same relentless barking. At first, Thomas barely paid it any mind. Stray dogs weren't uncommon in rural areas, and this one was probably just spooked by the train. But as the days turned into weeks, the dog's persistence became impossible to ignore. Every single morning, without fail, it was there barking, watching, waiting. It wasn't just some random outburst either. The dog never chased the train, never strayed from its position, never tried to run across the tracks. It simply stood there, tail stiff, ears perked up, barking furiously as if trying to send some urgent message. At first, Thomas was annoyed.
"That damn dog again,"
he muttered under his breath one morning, shaking his head as he adjusted the controls. A few of the other railway workers had noticed it too.
"Seen that stray by the crossing?"
One of them asked over coffee in the break room.
"Barks at the train like it's got a personal vendetta."
Thomas only grunted in response. He didn't have time for mysteries. His job was to keep the train on schedule, not to worry about some scruffy mutt. But the dog never missed a day. Even in the pouring rain, when the tracks were slick and the fields turned to mud, it was there. In the freezing cold, when the morning frost painted the landscape in white, it stood firm. One particularly foggy morning, Thomas barely made out the figure standing near the crossing. But sure enough, just as the train neared, the barking began muffled at first, then sharp and insistent as the train rolled past. Something about the scene gave Thomas an eerie feeling. What was this dog trying to do? Was it warning the train? Was it waiting for something? By now, he had stopped feeling annoyed and started feeling curious. The golden retriever mix wasn't a young pup, but it wasn't old either. Its fur was a bit unkempt, as if it had been living rough for a while. It had no collar, no leash, no sign of an owner. And yet, it didn't seem like a mindless stray. It had a purpose. One afternoon, while taking a short break before his return route, Thomas stopped by a small cafe in town. As he sipped his coffee, he couldn't help but overhear a conversation at a nearby table. The locals were discussing the Dogon animal that had become a familiar sight near the tracks. It had been there for years, always barking at every passing train. No one knew why. Some dismissed it as a stray that had lost its mind, while others speculated about its past. But no one had any real answers. Thomas frowned as he considered the mystery. He didn't believe the dog was simply crazy. There had to be a reason behind its actions, something that had driven it to return day after day to the same spot by the tracks. Yet, despite all the attention it had drawn, no one seemed to know where it had come from or what it was waiting for. For the first few weeks, Thomas tried to ignore the dog's barking, but as time went on, he found himself anticipating it. Every morning, as the train approached the familiar railway crossing, he would glance ahead, already expecting the scruffy golden retriever mix standing in its usual spot. And, without fail, there it was, barking loudly, tail stiff, eyes locked onto the train as if it had some kind of message to deliver. At some point, Thomas stopped being annoyed. The barking had become part of his routine, a strange but oddly comforting part of his morning. On the rare days when heavy fog obscured the landscape, he would strain his eyes through the mist, searching for the familiar outline of the dog. If he didn't spot it right away, an uneasy feeling would settle in his chest only to vanish when he finally caught sight of the dog's silhouette emerging from the fog. One morning, on impulse, he lifted a hand and waved as he passed. To his surprise, the dog stopped barking for a second. It tilted its head slightly, as if confused, then resumed barking as the train sped by. That small interaction sparked something in Thomas. The next morning, he waved again. This time, the dog hesitated just a little longer before barking, and so it became part of the ritual. The dog barked. Thomas waved. The passengers and crew on the train had also begun to notice. The train dog, as they called it, became a minor legend.
Your biggest fan is out there again.
One of the younger crew members joked as he walked through the engine cabin.
You should sign autographs.
Another quipped. Even the passengers, especially the ones who took the train regular, began talking about it. Some even made bets on whether the dog would be there on a stormy day or if it would ever stop barking. But Thomas never laughed about it the way the others did. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, he felt a connection to the dog. It was as if the animal was trying to tell him something important, and though he had no idea what it was, he respected its persistence. One night, as Thomas lay in bed, he found himself thinking about another dog from long ago. His childhood dog, Max. He had been just 10 years old when his father brought Max home here, a lively black and white mutt with endless energy. Max had been his best friend, his adventure partner, his silent companion through the ups and downs of childhood. But then, one terrible evening, Max ran into the street. The screech of tires. A loud yelp. The moment Thomas had never been able to forget. Max had died instantly. For years, Thomas had refused to even think about getting another dog. He had convinced himself that losing one was too painful, that it was easier to live without that kind of attachment. And yet, here he was, decades later, looking forward to the barking of a stray dog by the train tracks. He sighed, rubbing his eyes. "You're getting soft, old man," he muttered to himself. But the next morning, as the train approached the crossing, he did more than just wave. Thomas had started carrying a small bag of food in the cabin with him. Nothing much, just bits of bread or scraps from his lunch. And as the train roared past the barking dog, he tossed a piece out the window. The dog paused for the first time. It sniffed the ground, ears twitching, then snatched up the food and ate it quickly before resuming its barking as the train disappeared down the tracks. Thomas smiled to himself. And so the ritual expanded. Every morning he would throw out a small piece of food, and every morning the dog would briefly break its barking just long enough to gobble it up. Over time, Thomas noticed that the dog wasn't as thin as before. It still looked rough, its fur tangled and dirty, but at least it wasn't starving. He wondered if anyone else in town fed it, or if it lived entirely on what he threw out of the train window each morning. Winter came, and Thomas worried. The snow piled high on the fields, the tracks frozen and glistening in the early morning light. Surely the dog wouldn't be out in such brutal weather. And yet there it was, standing in the same spot, barking at the train. It was shivering, its paws barely visible in the deep snow, but it had not abandoned its post. Thomas felt a strange mix of admiration and concern. What kind of dog would endure this, and why? By the time a full year had passed, Thomas realized something. This dog had become a part of his life. He never saw it anywhere else, ever roaming the streets of Pinehaven, never by the shops or near the train station. It only appeared at that one spot, as if it existed only for the train. And then another year passed, and another. The barking, the waving, the food, it never stopped. Passengers still talked about the train dog, laughing about its dedication, but Thomas stopped seeing it as a joke. He had begun to ask himself the question he had avoided for so long. Why? Why was the dog there day after day, year after year? What was it waiting for? What did it want? 3 years had gone by, and Thomas still didn't have an answer. For 3 years, Thomas had grown used to the rhythm of the train and the dog. Every morning, without fail, the scruffy golden retriever mix would be standing near the railway crossing, barking its usual greeting. It was a constant, something as reliable as the sun rising each day. But that morning something was different. As Thomas guided the train around the familiar bend, he felt it before he saw it, before he didn't see it. The dog wasn't there. Thomas sat up straighter, scanning the railway crossing ahead. Maybe he had missed it? Maybe it was sitting further back, hidden in the grass? But as the train rumbled past the usual spot, the landscape was eerily quiet. No barking, no wagging tail, no familiar golden fur standing out against the earth. Nothing. Thomas's hands tightened on the controls. He told himself it was nothing to worry about. Maybe the dog had wandered off that morning. Maybe it was just running late. It would be there tomorrow. But the next day came, and the dog wasn't there. And the next, and the next. By the end of the week, Thomas knew something was wrong. He hadn't realized just how much he relied on that barking until it was gone. At first, he told himself he was being ridiculous. It was just a stray dog. Why should it matter so much? But every morning, as the train approached that crossing, he felt a strange, unsettling hollowness in his chest. The absence of the dog made the world seem off balance, like a missing puzzle piece that should have been there. The other railway workers noticed too. They exchanged glances over their morning coffee, murmuring about how the train dog was still nowhere to be seen. Some speculated that someone might have taken it in, while others suggested a harsher possibility that perhaps it had finally given up, as strays didn't last forever. Thomas didn't like that answer. At first, he thought it was ridiculous to care so much. The dog had never been his. It had never belonged to anyone. It had simply been there, existing alongside his train for 3 years. But that was precisely the problem. The dog had never missed a single day through rain, freezing cold, even the worst snowstorm. Its sudden disappearance made no sense. The next morning, after his shift, Thomas did something he had never done before. He started asking around town. It felt strange, like searching for something he wasn't even sure needed to be found. At the general store, he spoke with the woman behind the counter, a friendly older lady who had lived in Pinehaven for years. When he mentioned the train dog, her brow furrowed in thought. She admitted she hadn't seen it in a while and, now that she thought about it, had no idea where it might have gone. Nobody did. The dog had simply appeared one day, and now it had vanished just as mysteriously. Everywhere Thomas went, the answers were the same. No one knew anything more than he did. Nobody knew anything about the dog. Nobody had ever fed it, owned it, or taken it in. For years, it had simply been a part of the town, always there, but never really belonging to anyone. It was as if it had existed in a world just outside of everyone's notice, except for those who rode the train. By the time Thomas got back home that night, he felt restless. There were too many questions circling in his mind. Why had the dog always been there? Why had it disappeared so suddenly? Had something happened to it? As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he made a decision. He had to find out. On his day off, Thomas woke early. The moment the sun peeked over the horizon, he was already dressed, pulling on his coat and boots. Today, he wasn't going to drive the train. Today, he was going to follow the path where the dog used to stand. Something deep inside told him this wasn't just a meaningless disappearance. There was something more to this mystery. And he was going to find out what it was, even if it led him somewhere he wasn't prepared for. The woods were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. Thomas pushed forward, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he followed the narrow, overgrown path leading away from the railway crossing. The absence of the dog's barking still lingered in his mind, like a song that had abruptly stopped playing after years on repeat. It was colder beneath the thick canopy of trees, the air tinged with the scent of moss and damp wood. The deeper he went, the less it felt like a place people visited. The branches twisted overhead, forming a tunnel that swallowed the morning light, casting shadows that danced with every movement. The dog had come from this direction. That much was clear. But where had it gone? After nearly an hour of walking, he spotted something through the trees, a small, dilapidated shack, half hidden by overgrown weeds and creeping ivy. The wooden walls were weathered and cracked, the roof sagging as if the forest had been slowly reclaiming it. It looked abandoned, forgotten. Thomas hesitated before stepping forward. Something about the place felt wrong. He pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The shack was bare. Dust clung to the air, disturbed by his presence. A small wooden table stood in the corner, its surface covered in dirt and scattered leaves. Against the far wall, a rusted bed frame with a thin, tattered mattress sagged under years of neglect. Then, in the dim light filtering through a cracked window, Thomas saw them small, silent remnants of the past. On the floor, near the doorway, lay an old, faded dog collar. The leather was cracked with age, but the engraved metal tag was still readable. Buddy. Thomas crouched down, running his fingers over the worn leather. The name felt familiar, as if he had heard it whispered in the wind. Beside the collar, partially buried in dust, was a photo frame. The glass was missing, the metal edges rusted, but the picture inside was still intact. A young boy stood in the photo, grinning widely, his arms wrapped around a golden retriever, the same dog that had barked at his train for the past 3 years. The date printed at the bottom of the picture made Thomas's breath catch. 3 years ago, the exact time the dog had started barking at his train. The weight of the realization settled heavily in his chest. This dog Buddy hadn't just been a random stray barking at the passing trains. It had belonged to someone. It had belonged to this boy. And for some reason, after 3 years, it had never left this place. Thomas carefully picked up the photo, brushing away the dust, and took a deep breath. There had to be more to this story. Back in town, Thomas sought out the oldest villager he could find, a man who had lived in Pinehaven longer than anyone. It took time, but eventually he found himself sitting across from the old man in a quiet corner of the general store. The moment Thomas mentioned the shack in the woods, the man's face darkened. He knew something. The story unfolded slowly, spoken in hushed, careful words. The boy in the photo was Danny. He had lived in that shack with his father, a man who worked odd jobs and mostly kept to himself. They weren't well known in town, but people saw them now and then, walking together near the woods, always accompanied by the loyal golden retriever, Buddy. Then, one night, everything changed. 3 years ago, Danny and his father had been crossing the train tracks near the very same railway crossing where the dog always stood. It was late, and the train had been coming through at full speed. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, whether the father had stumbled, whether he had misjudged the timing, or whether something else had gone wrong. But the result was the same. The train struck him. He had died instantly. Danny had survived the accident, but nobody saw him again after that night. Some said he had run away, too grief-stricken to stay in a place that had taken his father. Others believed he had left with distant relatives. But Buddy had been left behind. And ever since that night, the dog had stood at the railway crossing, barking at every passing train. Day after day, month after month, year after year, Thomas sat in silence as the weight of the stories sank in. The barking hadn't been random. It hadn't been a meaningless habit. Buddy had been warning the trains. As if it still remembered the night when the train had taken someone it loved. As if it had been trying, in its own way, to stop it from happening again. The revelation about Buddy and Danny weighed heavily on Thomas as he left the general store. For 3 years, the dog had been waiting. 3 years of unwavering loyalty. 3 years of barking at the train, as if trying to warn it, or perhaps call out for someone who never came. Now that Thomas knew the truth, he couldn't just leave it alone. He needed to find Danny. Thomas had no idea where to start. The boy had disappeared after the accident. Most assumed he had left town, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. He spent the next few days digging through every source of information he could. Find local records, newspaper clippings, anything that might give him a clue. Most of what he found only confirmed what the old villager had told him. The accident had been officially recorded. Danny's father had died instantly. No mention of what happened to the boy afterward. Thomas wasn't ready to give up. He started asking around first among the railway workers, then the older residents of Pinehaven. Eventually, someone mentioned that after the accident, a distant relative had tried to take Danny in but couldn't care for him. The boy had been sent to an orphanage in the city. That was all Thomas needed to hear. He took time off from work, packed a small bag, and boarded a train heading to the city. The orphanage was a worn-down brick building, standing solemnly in a quiet neighborhood. The windows were streaked with rain, the iron gate creaking as Thomas pushed it open. Inside, the atmosphere was somber. Children shuffled through the halls in faded clothes, their faces weary with a kind of loneliness that even time couldn't erase. Thomas spoke with the head caretaker, explaining why he had come.
Yes, Danny is still here. He's 13 now. He doesn't talk about the past much, but I do know he loved his dog. He used to ask about Buddy when he first arrived, but as the years passed, I think he assumed the worst.
She said. She led Thomas to a small common area where a few children sat reading and playing with old toys. Among them was a quiet boy with dark hair, sitting alone by the window, staring at the grey sky outside. Danny. Thomas felt a strange sense of recognition, even though he had never seen the boy before. Maybe it was because he had already come to know the child through Buddy's unwavering devotion. The caretaker gently called his name, and Danny turned, eyes cautious but curious.
This man wanted to speak with you.
Danny sat stiffly as Thomas lowered himself into the seat across from him. Thomas didn't know how to begin. How do you tell a child that his dog spent years waiting for him? He took a breath and spoke softly.
Danny, I know about Buddy.
At the sound of the dog's name, the boy's expression changed. His gaze sharpened, his fingers clenching slightly on the arm of the chair. The name pulled something deep from within him, something buried but never forgotten. Thomas continued, his voice steady yet gentle, aware of the weight of his words. He told the boy that Buddy had never left, that for 3 years the dog had stood at the train, crossing, barking, watching, always looking toward the tracks, waiting. Danny's lips parted slightly, but no words came. A sharp breath escaped him, his shoulders tensing. He blinked rapidly, his expression shifting between disbelief and something deeper, something raw, something aching. For the first time in years, the walls around his heart began to crack. Silence stretched between them as Danny sat, absorbing the impossible truth. The emotions in his eyes warred against each other, grief, guilt, hope, and something else that had no name. Thomas pressed forward, his voice unwavering. Buddy had never given up on him, and if he wanted, they could go see if the dog was still waiting. The words struck deep. Danny barely hesitated before nodding. The orphanage, after some consideration, agreed to let Thomas take the boy back to Pinehaven for a visit. It wasn't common for the children to leave, but the caretaker acknowledged that if the story was true, Danny deserved to know. For the first time in 3 years, Danny boarded a train. He sat by the window, his small hands gripping his sleeves tightly, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. He spoke little, but his silence was not empty, was heavy with expectation, fear, and longing. As Pinehaven neared, Thomas couldn't shake the question gnawing at his mind. Would Buddy still be there, waiting? The train ride felt both agonizingly slow and unbearably fast. Thomas remained beside Danny, watching as the boy stared out at the changing scenery. His hands remained clenched together, his thoughts locked away behind an expression that revealed everything and nothing at once. They arrived in the early afternoon, greeted by the crisp scent of pine and damp earth. Thomas led Danny through the familiar streets past the old general store, the train station, and finally the railway crossing. The place where Buddy had once stood, unwavering in his watch. But the dog was nowhere to be seen. A flicker of hope dimmed in Danny's eyes, but Thomas refused to let it extinguish completely. The search wasn't over. They retraced the paths Thomas had once walked, venturing deeper into the woods where Buddy might have gone. Hours passed, the sun dipping lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the thick underbrush. Still, there was no sign of Buddy. Danny called his name repeatedly, his voice echoing through the trees.
Buddy, it's me, I'm here.
But silence was his only answer. The deeper they went, the more worried Thomas became. What if they were too late? Buddy had spent years out here, alone through scorching summers, freezing winters, storms and hunger. And now he had vanished. Then, just as Thomas was about to suggest they turn back and search another route, Danny froze. His head snapped toward a clearing just ahead. And then a sound. A faint, barely audible whimper. Danny didn't hesitate. He ran toward it, crashing through the undergrowth, Thomas following closely behind. There, beneath the shelter of an old fallen tree, lay Buddy. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Buddy looked frail. His once thick golden fur was matted with dirt, his ribs more pronounced than Thomas remembered. One of his hind legs was stretched out at an odd angle, and as they got closer, they saw the deep scratches and bruises along his body. It didn't take much to piece it together. The dog must have been hit by a car while searching for food. For a moment, the sight of him lying there so still, so weak made Thomas think the worst. But then Danny whispered his name.
Buddy.
At the sound of his voice, the dog's ears twitched ever so slightly. And then his tail moved just the tiniest wag, a weak but unmistakable flicker of recognition. Danny dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the dog's head. Buddy lifted his gaze, his once bright eyes dulled by exhaustion but still filled with something powerful of loyalty, an unbreakable bond. A quiet whimper escaped the dog's throat as he struggled to move, to close the distance between them. Despite the pain, despite the years, Buddy still wanted to be near him. Danny let out a choked sob and wrapped his arms around the dog's frail body.
I'm here. Buddy. I'm here.
Tears streamed down the boy's face, his shoulders shaking as he clung to the only family he had left. The weight of years apart, of loneliness and longing, poured from him in silent sobs. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. They had found Buddy. But now, they had to save him. Moving quickly, he lifted the dog as gently as possible. Buddy whimpered in pain, but didn't resist somehow, understanding that these hands meant to help. Danny, refusing to let go, clutched Buddy's paw even as they hurried toward town. Every step felt too slow, every second a race against time. Their only hope lay at the veterinarian's clinic. By the time they arrived, Buddy was barely conscious. The veterinarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, wasted no time. She ushered them inside, placed Buddy on the examination table, and immediately began assessing his injuries. Danny hovered close, unable to stand still. His whole body remained tense, as if afraid that even breathing might shatter what little hope remained. Thomas rested a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder, but the air in the room was thick with fear and uncertainty. The vet worked in silence, her expression unreadable as she cleaned wounds, checked Buddy's breathing, and carefully examined his broken leg. Every second dragged on unbearably. Then, finally, she sighed. Buddy was in bad shape, but he was a fighter. With the right care, he would pull through. Danny collapsed against Thomas, the weight of his fear and uncertainty breaking all at once. A shaky breath escaped him, his face pressing into his sleeve to hide the tears that wouldn't stop. But this time, the tears carried relief. Buddy was going to live. Over the following weeks, Danny rarely left Buddy's side. The dog remained at the clinic for treatment, his strength returning little by little. Each day, Danny sat beside him, speaking softly, feeding him, running his fingers through the familiar golden fur that had once been his only warmth. And Buddy? He never took his eyes off Danny. For 3 long years he had waited. Now, he wouldn't let Danny out of his sight. The day Buddy was finally strong enough to stand on his own, Danny beamed brighter than Thomas had ever seen before. The dog wobbled, still adjusting to his healing leg. But the moment he pressed his face into Danny's hands, his tail began to wag for the first time in weeks. It was as if no time had passed at all. But one question remained: what would happen to Danny now? He had no family left, no home to return to. The orphanage had been his only shelter for years. And now? Thomas had spent days turning the thought over in his mind. He had always lived alone, had never seen himself as the fatherly type, and yet, for months, he had felt a connection to a dog he hadn't even known. That connection had led him here, to something bigger, to someone bigger. One evening, as they sat beside Buddy's bed at the clinic, Thomas finally spoke. His voice was steady but hesitant, aware of the weight of the moment. He had an extra room. It wasn't much, but it was something. Danny didn't have to go back. The boy froze, his fingers curling in Buddy's fur. A whisper of disbelief escaped him a single word, carrying all the fragile hope he had left. "Really?" Thomas nodded. The silence stretched for only a moment, before Danny leaned into his side, a quiet "thank you" slipping from his lips. Buddy let out a soft huff of contentment, resting his head on Danny's lap. For the first time in a long time, they were home. The adoption papers sat on Thomas's wooden desk, the ink still fresh. His fingers brushed over the document, feeling the weight of what he had done. Danny was no longer alone. The boy stood beside him, hesitant, as if waiting for the world to undo what had just happened, to wake up back in the orphanage, to find Buddy nothing more than a dream. But the moment never came. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the reality of it. The words came simply, but they meant everything. This was home now. Danny gave a quiet nod, unable to fully speak through the emotion rising in his throat. Buddy, now stronger, pressed against Danny's leg. His golden fur had regained its shine, his tail wagging in slow, steady movements. For 3 years he had waited. Now there was no more waiting. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of adjustment. Danny moved carefully through the house, cautious, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. He spoke little at first, preferring to sit with Buddy on the porch, watching the world pass by. Thomas gave him space. He understood the weight of old wounds. Buddy, on the other hand, thrived. His injuries healed well, though a limp remained. It didn't slow him down. He followed Danny everywhere, never straying ferries if making up for lost time. The once silent house now carried the sound of paws on wooden floors, of hesitant laughter whenever Buddy did something ridiculous, of the soft creak of an old bed frame when Danny shifted at night. It no longer felt empty. One afternoon, Thomas found Danny in the backyard, running his fingers through Buddy's fur, gazing quietly at the sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It didn't feel real. Thomas leaned against the porch railing. It was. Danny nodded, but still looked uncertain, as if the past might find a way to take this from him. But the past was behind them now. The town of Pinehaven remained unchanged. Thomas's train route remained the same. Every morning he climbed into the locomotive, the controls familiar beneath his hands, the tracks stretching out before him. But there was one difference. Each time the train pulled into the station, Danny and Buddy were there. No longer barking, no longer trying to stop the train. Instead, they stood on the platform watching, waiting, waving. Buddy's tail wagged happily, his barking replaced with eager excitement. Danny, once a lonely shadow of a boy, now stood tall beside him, his expression calm, content. Thomas tipped his cap toward Thema's silent greeting before pulling the lever and setting the train in motion. For years he had heard the dog's cries, thinking them a warning, a desperate plea to stop the train from taking another life. But now he understood. It had been a call for help, a call to bring Danny home. And somehow, against all odds, that call had been answered. Seasons passed. Summer heat faded into the crisp winds of autumn, then into the quiet snowfall of winter. Danny was no longer the withdrawn boy Thomas had met at the orphanage. He smiled more now, spoke freely, helped around the house, and even joined Thomas at the train yard, watching the workers prepare the engines for their next journeys. Buddy had found his rhythm too. No longer a stray, no longer waiting in the cold, he spent his days napping in sunlit patches, chasing leaves with Danny, curling up by the fire in the evenings. The past still lingered in small ways. Sometimes Danny went quiet near the railway crossing, his fingers clenching just for a moment. But he was learning to move forward. One evening, Thomas noticed Danny placing something on the mantel, a photograph. Old and worn, its edges curled from time. A picture of a younger Buddy, sitting beside a small boy Danny from long ago. Thomas said nothing. He simply nodded. Some things were worth keeping. One morning, as Thomas prepared for another trip, he glanced out the train window. Danny and Buddy stood on the platform as always, but this time Danny was waving. And beside him Buddy stood proudly, his tail wagging, as if saying, "You can go now. We're okay." A rare, genuine smile tugged at Thomas's lips. The whistle blew, not as a farewell to a lonely dog barking in the distance, but as a farewell to the past, to waiting, to grief, to being lost. As the train rode forward, Thomas looked back one last time. Danny and Buddy stood side by side, watching him gone out, as a warning, not as a plea, but as a thank you. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas knew that some stories, no matter how unexpected, always find the right ending.